series of world history. This time we're going to be getting together and we're going to be filling in kind of that middle area of the Fertile Crescent. We had talked about the eastern prong with Mesopotamia in Asia, and then we shifted into northeast Africa, talking about the Nile River basin with the flowering of the Egyptian civilization. So we've got the two wings, and now we're going to fill in that middle piece. We talk about Levant, Palestine, this kind of area, and then also in continuing to discuss how these outside influences begin to impede on this area where the growth of these great sort of Middle Eastern empires begin to rise. We'll talk about Babylon. We'll talk about some of these other major intellectual and political advances take place as well. So one of our main groups of people that we're going to talk about are going to be the Hebrews, and then also some of these other groups of people that are going to have an influence on the area of the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, the Hebrews, many of you, if you paid attention in Sunday school, probably have heard this term before. Hebrews, yeah, it's something, it was on TV, it was like Charlton Heston or something like that, yeah. These people are descendants of pastoral culture. These are people that for a long time represented this sort of middle niche in between the major life patterns of human beings, where you've got the hunter-gatherers that sort of move about, and then you've got the agriculturalists who have settled into one spot and they've domesticated both plants and animals. The pastoral cultures, these life patterns represent people who are sort of in between, that they haven't quite domesticated plants, or at least they haven't settled into sedentary agriculture, but for the most part they have domesticated animals, and they are going to be living in such a way that they'll have to move their herds from place to place. So hence the nomadic side, and of course a lot of these people are going to be represented with various types of fauna that they're going to have with them. And their language group descends from northwest Mesopotamia, Paddan Aram, in this kind of what is now sort of northeastern Syria, northwestern Iraq, right? Now, the oral tradition amongst, and written tradition amongst the Hebrews themselves is that they were escaped slaves that had been held in Egypt for several hundred years, and then they overran what became known as the territory of Canaan, and they set up a nation along various sort of familial tribal lines. They also have a very novel belief system in the history of the world, and that is a very strict form of monotheism. Now, when we go forward, we can do a little bit of the political history, and then we'll back up and we'll do some of the cultural history with this. Now, Israel is initially divided, relatively limited amount of any kind of central government, but then would politically unite under a king named Saul, and then a new dynasty started by David and Solomon. David and Solomon represent kind of the height of Israel's both political and economic power, as they extend all the way from the borders of Egypt, the Wadi of Egypt, all the way to the upper reaches of the Euphrates River. So it's a very long sort of stretch. Basically, the entire eastern Mediterranean shoreline is dominated by Israel. Because they have such a heavy control over this really important trade route that exists between these two edges of these great civilizing cultures, the Mesopotamian cultures and the Egyptian cultures, they're going to have a great deal of access to wealth. Trade is also going to begin to go outward on both the Mediterranean and out into the Indian Ocean. And so Israel, as a nexus point for these various various routes of trade, is going to become exceedingly wealthy. As I mentioned, they dominate this coastal area, and they're going to fill this power vacuum because at this point in the history of these other areas, both Mesopotamia and Egypt are experiencing periods of decline, where they are sort of pulling back, and just the moment where they're pulling away from Israel, Israel is poised and in a united, both militarily and politically, situation to expand outward to fill that power vacuum. Well, like we've seen with a lot of the cultures that we talked about last time, when civilizations get very wealthy and very powerful, they tend to fight amongst themselves over that wealth and over that power, and Israel is no different in this regard. They're going to have a sort of mini civil war. They're going to split their kingdom after Solomon dies. Part of the kingdom is going to follow Solomon's direct heir. The other part of the kingdom is going to have a new dynasty, and it's going to go off in its own direction. Two of the tribes go kind of one way. The rest of the tribes go the other way. And because of this split, they're never able to regain the power that they had had as a united nation under the David-Solomon dynasty. And we're going to see that also growing powers, especially in Mesopotamia, are going to rise to threaten them. The Assyrian Empire, based with the capital of Nineveh, is going to have political problems with first the northern nation of Israel. It's going to attack it over the course of several years. It's going to lay siege to many of its fortified cities, and eventually is going to deport its people to the eastern provinces to try to get rid of any troublemakers. Babylon is going to rise to power, and first is going to destroy the Assyrian Empire, and then is going to establish itself as kind of the new power in this part of the world, and is going to be looking to expand itself at the expense of its neighbors, Judah, of course, being one of these neighbors, and Babylon is eventually going to send an army to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. It's going to knock down the wall, advance into the city, and eventually is going to capture Judah and deport the southern part of the Jewish kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, in particular, is going to be interested in deporting the wealthy and the educated to Babylon and its eastern precincts in order to deny any of these conquered people the ability to rise up in rebellion. The people who are wealthy, well-connected, well-educated, well-organized. These are the people that would lead any kind of future insurrection. And so that's why you'll see these policies, especially these Middle Eastern empires, of deportation, is they're going to try to head off any future problems that they might have with conquered people. And that's what you can see on this bas relief here, is a Mesopotamian soldier, and they're leading these Jews that have been captured off in chains to the east. Well, the Jewish cultural heritage, as I mentioned, is very interesting. It was not polytheistic, the many-god religion that you could see most of their neighbors had. It was a very strict form of monotheism, and that is the belief in one God, right? And to put this into a sort of broader perspective, to give it a little bit more depth, there were plenty of places that were monotheistic at this point, sort of, right? The idea that our city has this God, and he's our God, right? Or she's our goddess, or that kind of thing, that they represent us. You'd say, oh, that's a form of monotheism. Not really, not in this sort of sense. While you might identify with one, many of these, actually all the other cultures around them, generally speaking, they believe that, well, other gods are kind of out there, but they may be puny, they may be false gods, they may have problems. Our God is better than their God, that kind of mentality. And that was often attributed to why, when countries or cities would lose wars, well, our God was beaten by their God, but our God will come back. He's really awesome God. The Jews, if they're going to strictly adhere to what they're supposed to, according to their religion, is they have to deny the existence of all other gods. That, there's one God, that's it, and there's nothing else, right? Moreover, there's a pretty strong sensibility about who this God is and what his deal is, that their God is eternal, having always existed and would always exist, has whatever power that he deems necessary, and knows everything that is going on. There's also a really strong sense of the Jews' sense of historicity in their story in relationship to their God, unlike many of these other groups of people that, well, there's a sort of creation story, and we try not to upset the gods, and we sacrifice bulls, or we have, pagan temple worship or something like that to appease them. We try to keep them, pleased. A few of them you'll see that they'll even have sort of destruction mythology. Where exactly they fit in on that scale, though, stands in pretty stark relief to the Hebrews in that there's a creation story, and that they're involved with this, and there's other people that are involved with this, and the belief system was that the Hebrews felt that they were chosen. They were special people chosen by God as part of this ongoing relationship between themselves and God and the rest of humanity. So that is a very different sort of situation as there, right? Well, that was what they were supposed to do. The Israelites, though, once they had occupied this territory of the Eastern Mediterranean, really had never totally held to the monotheism, and often they would descend down into various forms of paganism. Generally speaking, they were aping, their neighbors' practices, people around them that were polytheistic. And in many cases, that's what they would do, is they would set up little pagan worship shrines throughout Israel and Judah, and they would still go to temple worship in Jerusalem. But then also, well, maybe we ought to pray to Ashtoreth, maybe we ought to pray to Baal, just to keep everybody happy, that kind of thing. Well, what's going to happen here is this exile in Babylon that takes place. These people that are deported to Babylon, and it's a 70-year exile, so it's multi-generational, is really going to force a lot of these Jews to kind of question their faith. How can we be Jews if God is eternal and powerful, and he can control events on earth, and then we get smacked, right? why is it that we should continue to do this if God's going to allow these bad things to kind of happen to us? I mean, you read this all throughout the literature of this period that the Jews are doing. And of course, many of them had practical problems. How are we supposed to pray when our religious rites require us to go back to Jerusalem and pray at the temple, and the temple's not there, Jerusalem's been captured, we're stuck here in the east? So there are a bunch of questions that these people had. However, what we're going to see is when the Persians come in and they knock the Babylonians out of power, part of their policy is, well, let's be nice to these conquered people and maybe they'll be nice to us. And so they're going to allow these captives to return. What we're going to see, though, is they get very serious about monotheism. That the conclusion that they come to is that, well, Babylonian polytheism is what had caused all these problems, and so we're going to make really, really sure that we're not going to have any more polytheism. And in fact, they go through a pretty heartbreaking scene here where many of their Jewish leadership forces them to divorce many of their pagan wives and get rid of any of these influences from this point forward. All right. Well, we had talked about the Assyrian Empire a little bit before, and now let's flip back on the other side and we can take a look at who these guys are. And what they're doing sort of within their own kind of context, all right? One of their major assets they're going to have is a very large, powerful city on the upper Tigris River called Nineveh, right? And their main strength that they have going forward for why they become such a dominant military force, or why they become such a dominant force in the area, is their military. Military is actually pretty innovative for their time period. For one, they're one of the early ones to have systemic use of iron weapons, which is much better than the bronze weaponry that their opponents generally were using. Also, they were pretty innovative at overcoming what many people saw as the number one sort of defensive technique of the area, which was walled cities. Generally speaking, a lot of people throughout this period of time, whenever you are worried about attack from potential enemies that are also your neighbors, you're going to take defensive preparations for your living space. So what you'll see is many of these people are going to situate their living spaces on top of hills. They're going to build walls, moats, ditches, fortifications around this of various types. And in many cases, they were largely effective, right? That you're going to build this big army, and it doesn't matter how many guys and horses and whatnot that you have. If you come to a wall that's too big to try to scale up and over, then in many cases an enemy that is in there can defy you for very long periods of time, as long as their food and water hold out. Well, what you're going to see is the Assyrians are going to turn that thinking on its ear, because they come up with the first, not necessarily the first use, but the first systemic use of, we need specialized equipment. If we have specialized pieces of equipment that can overcome these, for example, walled cities, then all of a sudden, the idea that, okay, well, we get attacked by an enemy, we're going to hold them back with our walls, we'll send for help, and then, help will come and drive off the enemy. All of a sudden, what if we can capture a walled city very, very quickly? By scaling up and over the wall, knocking the wall down, battering in the gates, tunneling under the wall. That's what these guys are going to be very adept at. And when most people's assumptions are that, well, armies come in and they take a certain amount of time to attack a city, then all of a sudden, when you take that mathematical equation and you change it, it really radically changes people's military response and what they can and can't do to you. Also, we're going to see that these guys are pretty organized in terms of the internal structure of their army, standardized units, standardized commands, the idea that various regional commanders are going to have levies that they're going to use to their troops. This, again, is something that modern militaries use pretty ubiquitously, right? They eventually are going to fall to the Babylonians after internal strife weakened the state from the inside. Also, the Babylonians are going to kind of take advantage of the fact that they're able to get into Nineveh's walled city. But that's what's going to happen to these guys after they had had a pretty strong, effective change on the region, right? Another important group of people, not so much for their military contributions, but for their intellectual contributions and their economic contributions, are the Phoenicians, right? Now, these are the ones that are going to be living along the coastal areas of the eastern Mediterranean. You'll see that if Israel's kind of in the southeast corner, these guys are just north of them, roughly in kind of the Lebanon area of what is now the modern Middle East. And which is, these guys are, not to say that they don't have any kind of military or state building apparatus, but generally speaking, we remember the Phoenicians for their concentration on oceanic trade, right? Their ability to put together very large fleets of sailing vessels to go thither and yon to trade in goods various and sundry all throughout the first Mediterranean, and eventually they're going to be so adept at trade that they're eventually going to leave the Mediterranean Sea, and they're going to venture out through the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually their trading missions are going to leave finds that we know that they had visited Britain in the north and southern Africa in the south, and so the Phoenicians were kind of everywhere, right? And one of the interesting side effects of the Phoenician trading adventure is the fact that they ran into so many different people that spoke so many different languages. And of course, one of the requirements that you're going to have in order to be a successful merchant is good record keeping. Where did you go? Who did you meet? How much did you buy? Right? What did you buy? When was it available? Right? And so you're going to need some kind of written record keeping process, right? And we talked previously about some of these record keeping techniques where you had the cuneiform kind of tablets, these big heavy rock things with the wedges that the people in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian culture had created. The Egyptians are some of the first ones to work on sort of what more or less what you and I would call paper, where you can do it with kind of pen and ink in their hieroglyphic or their hieratic script. But one of the most successful ones of these recording systems are going to be from the Phoenicians, and that is the creation of what you and I would recognize as an alphabet. So instead of a syllabic or word association or idea association for each symbol, we're going to have that each symbol represents a sound. Therefore, you can say any word in any language if you can write it down phonetically, right? If you say, oh, what does it sound like? Okay, I can write it down. I may not know what it means, you may not be able to translate it, but you can write down any word and you can read it back later as long as you know what each letter sounds like. And a good example of this in terms of comparing linguistic routes of how languages are put together, once you learn your alphabet, right, there's only 26 characters to keep track of in your head. This is for the most part a pretty manageable number. Most 3- and 4-year-olds can learn their alphabet by just remembering Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right? You can remember what every sound that every letter makes. This is pretty manageable. You may not be able to totally understand all the words that you can read, but you can talk to most early readers, little kids even, and say, okay, you can sound that word out. They may not know what it means, but they can sound it out. You contrast this to some of the Eastern philosophies behind language, and you'll see that there are thousands of characters. I think it's like 3,000 characters in Chinese. And there's no way for you to know them all. Even the most educated people, scholars in Chinese, can't know them all because there's just too many to remember. And there are obviously ones that you're going to use more often than not. But this is going to not only be a really great idea that the Phoenicians come up with, but is also going to be something that's going to spread and be easily used by other cultures because of the omnipresence, seemingly, of the Phoenicians amongst them in these trading ventures. And so this is where this idea is going to spread through, especially Western culture, is from the groups of Phoenicians. Right? One of the major impacts in world history is going to come from the Persians. Persians are this military empire that begins from what is now sort of southwestern Iran, essentially Iran and Persia more or less similar, or more or less the same here. And our first main character that we want to talk about here is this guy named Cyrus, right? And he earns this epithet, the Great, right? Whenever you get the Great attached to your name, you know something big is going to happen as a result of this. And Cyrus was not only the political leader, he was the king of the Persians, but he also was a great military leader. And one of the things that we'll notice again and again is whenever you take those two things and fuse them together, you always get spectacular results, where you get the person who has either total or near total political power, and then also they happen to be a great military figure. You get noteworthy results. Well, it also helps that Cyrus is emerging onto the scene just at a moment of their neighbors' internal strife. And they're going to move in militarily, and they're going to take these places over. And one of the, especially throughout Mesopotamia and this part of the Middle East, one of the things that we'll notice, and I want you to pay attention to this as we go throughout the rest of the semester, it's not hard to take places over. We'll notice that conquerors are going to come and go, that people are going to come in and they're going to take over very large empires of the world. Whether it's talking about Cyrus here, whether it's talking about the Babylonians that preceded him, whether we're talking about the Greeks under Alexander, whether we're talking about the Romans, whether we're talking about Genghis Khan, right? Whether we're talking about the Spanish when we get to the 1500s. That kind of thing is going to happen. And while there's a lot of fighting, and I don't want to take anything away from that angle of it, but generally speaking, it's very doable. It gets done a lot throughout history. The real question and the real problem is, okay, once you take over a very large area and you've got a whole bunch of people that aren't necessarily your people that you've conquered, what are you going to do to keep an empire together? And we'll see that there are various attempts at this. We'll see that the Assyrians and the Babylonians both had a similar philosophy, and that is to keep them from rebelling against you, you deport their leadership, right? Well, that of course makes them mad and upset, right? The Persian method, at least especially initially under Cyrus, is let's try to win some people over. Let's try to win their loyalty through kindness rather than cruelty. So for example, to this end, it's going to be Cyrus that's going to release the Jewish captives back to Jerusalem from Babylon, right? Well, Cyrus, though, like all leaders throughout history, eventually is going to die, right? He's going to assume room temperature. And you have another question when it comes to political governance, which is, okay, we've got this style of government. It seems to work. How do we get it to the next generation, right? How do we keep it stable going forward? Well, we're going to see that this is monarchy, where the children are going to inherit the political power from their ancestors. And so the next guy we have to talk about is Darius. And I pronounce it that way. I had a British professor in college that pronounced it that way, and I picked it up, even though most people pronounce it Darius. You can say it however, this is just on tapes, on video. I can't hear you, so you can say it however you want to while you're watching your computer. Darius is Cyrus's grandson, and he's going to continue to expand Persian control down into Africa, into southeastern Europe, and then also eastward into what is now northern India. He had a ridiculously large empire, and his military reflected that. He had a very large army, and it was an international one that, generally speaking, relied on a levy. So you have two philosophies that accumulate around a military, especially at this point, but also really, down to today, which is, are you going to have a volunteer kind of military, or are you going to have a professional military? Now, both of them have advantages and disadvantages, right? The advantage of a sort of volunteer or a militia system, or you just, you draft guys for short periods of time, one of the major advantages of this is you don't have to pay them. You don't have to pay them for very long. They're only going to be in service for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year or two, right? And then they're going to go home. So you don't have to pay them for very long, right? Also, since they're not going to be in the army for 10, 20 years, most of these people are going to be able to leave their homes for relatively short periods of time to go and serve in the military, and that means that you're going to get some pretty large armies. You're going to have very large numbers of people. So you send out the levy, the order for the army to assemble, all the local commanders to pull up as many people as they can, and you can get together a pretty large army over a short period of time. So those are the pros, all right? The downside is these guys don't spend a lot of time practicing, so their quality is going to be kind of suspect, right? And in many cases, you're going to have these groups are going to fight in different sort of polyglot formations. You're not going to have a lot of homogeneity in terms of weapons, tactics, commands. Languages are going to be a barrier. The other side of this, right, if you use a professional army, is it's expensive, right? You got to pay these guys. You're not going to get tons and tons of people because this is going to be their job. And if everybody, quits working at the farm or in the factory or in town or whatever, you're not going to have anybody in society in order to generate the resources to support a large professional force, right? The upside to this, though, of course, is they're going to be really high quality. They're going to have all the same tactics. They're going to have a lot of time working together and practicing together, so their efficiency is going to go up. Generally speaking, under Darius, you're going to have sort of a combination of the two, where you've got this professional core and then a much larger international levy army that he's going to be able to call on. The Persians were the first ones to really do large-scale mastery over infrastructural links between these areas, using forts and roads and canals in order to connect the empire together to help defend it. And this is also going to not only create military stability, where you create the sense of safety, but these very same infrastructural components that you use essentially for foreign policy are going to help strengthen the internal economic situation, where people are going to be able to use roads and canals to transport goods and services, and people back and forth to where they need to internally within the empire, and then also forts are going to protect any economic activity that's taking place. And so what's going to happen is this is going to lead to massive economic expansion for the Persians. Well, when you have military stability, economic expansion, this is a recipe for wealth, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Over the course of time, the Persian emperors are going to become exceedingly wealthy, which, once it gets multi-generational, one of the problems of monarchy is when people have to, like Cyrus, sort of expand outward and use their military and take over large kingdoms. That's their experience growing up. Whereas your grandson, your great-grandson, he grew up in the palace. He assumes that the wealth and power is his for the taking. It's easy for these guys to become sort of spoiled brats. And there's going to be a great deal of extravagance that's going to creep into the monarchy and the nobility. And this is going to become a source for increasing internal instability as more and more people are saying, wait a minute, we got to pay more in taxes so that this guy can have a summer palace because the summer palace is too warm in the summer where it is, the winter palace. So anyway, you'll have moments like that, right? Got another fun little sidelight to this to give you an idea of some of the other religious practices that aren't some of the sort of major ones that are evidenced in the world today. We'll talk about some of the rest of these as much as we can. But we have the Persian religion, generally speaking, was dominated by polytheistic nature of worship, not terribly different than some of the other Mesopotamian, polytheistic sort of nature gods and goddesses, that kind of thing, the caprices of nature. And all that's going to get turned on its ear by Zoroaster. And again, I'm not exactly sure that's how he would have pronounced it. I've heard people pronounce it Zoroaster. Sure, why not? Whatever. So anyway, he was a 7th century BC prophet, so he's in the 600s BC. And he is going to come in and radically change Persian theology, and thus is going to bring in new theological precepts all throughout the empire. All right? And his idea is that there's only one God that people should be on the side of, and that's Ahura Mazda, right? And Ahura Mazda represents goodness and light. But this isn't monotheism in the same sense that you have with the Jews, because this is actually a dualist model where you have Ahura Mazda, who's essentially the good guy, goodness, light, order, honesty, truth, the American way, I don't know, all that kind of stuff, right? And Ahura Mazda, though, is opposed by this guy named Ahriman, right? Now, Ahriman is sort of the bad guy, right? So if you've got this, Ahura Mazda is sort of the light side of the force, Ahriman is the dark side of the force, right? Ahriman is the spirit of evil, chaos, disorder, all that kind of thing. And Zoroaster spoke of an apocalyptic cataclysm at the end of time, that there would be a clash between good and evil, but the question was who was going to win, right? Who was going to win with this, right? And Zoroaster told people that they needed to be on the side of good. They needed to be on Ahriman's side, right? Or on Ahura Mazda's side, rather. So that way Ahura Mazda would win this final confrontation. He would have more followers, and that goodness and light and all that kind of stuff would prevail at the end. Well, that's very interesting, right? But what we're going to see is the way that this plays out through history is Persian kings and the Persian nobility, generally speaking, is going to convert over to this, and they're going to sort of press this ever increasingly culturally towards the lower classes of people. Generally speaking, though, the common people were pretty reluctant to give up on their traditional religion of polytheism. And what we're going to see here is, generally speaking, they say, oh, yeah, Ahura Mazda, good guy, yeah, but also our God here, our local God, he's a lesser God under Ahura Mazda. He's a helpful guy, right? And so we're going to add him kind of to this religious structure. So what's going to happen is over the course of time this is going to become essentially a polytheistic understanding rather than what probably Zoroaster initially had in store at the beginning of Zoroastrianism. And so what's interesting is when you compare this to a lot of other religions of the area at this point, they bear some pretty striking similarities. There's good, there's evil, right? There is an important difference of the fact that both Christians and Jews stress the idea that there is monotheism. Muslims also would later do this as well, but it shares this apocalyptic sensibility with Christianity in that there's going to be this final sort of cataclysmic battle between good and evil. One, of course, important differences there is Christians are very clear that, well, the good guys win, right? When you look at some of this iconography, though, it's pretty interesting, right? We've got Ahura Mazda here, who, if I just show you, a picture of a dude with wings shooting out his back, and he's flying around, you would either say, well, he's an angel, or he's, one of the X-Men named Angel, And then you got this guy who's got fangs and big ears and horns, and oh yeah, it's the devil. Yeah, I dressed up like him for Halloween one year, you might say. I don't know. And nope, this is actually Ahriman, right? This is the bad guy in all of this. And so there's our cultural history and socio-political history of this region. And then next week we'll get back together and we'll talk some more about various other civilization advancements.